I sat in the church, the wooden pew digging into my back, but I barely noticed the discomfort. The preacher's voice echoed through the sanctuary, words about Beckett's bravery and kindness washing over me without really sinking in. My eyes fixed on the empty casket at the front. They never found his body in that river. A memory hit me hard. Beckett and I stretched out in the bed of his pickup, counting stars on a warm summer night after graduation. He'd pointed out constellations while I secretly watched his face, memorizing every detail. His hand had brushed mine that night, and for a brief moment, I'd thought, but I never had the courage to find out. Mrs. Hayes sobbed quietly in the front row. Behind me, hushed voices whispered about gunshots heard near the river that night. I clenched my fists, knuckles white. Another memory surfaced, riding horses along the back trails of his family's ranch. Beckett always rode ahead, but he'd constantly look back to check on me, flashing that crooked smile that made my heart skip. "Come on, city slicker," he'd tease, even though we grew up in the same small town. The folded flag on display next to the empty casket caught my eye. Beckett had looked so proud in his Marine uniform the day he left. I'd driven him to the bus station. The words "I love you" stuck in my throat. Instead, I'd said "stay safe." Now those unspoken words felt like stones in my chest. Two elderly women behind me whispered about tracks found near the riverbank, about how something didn't add up. I wanted to turn around and tell them to shut up, but I couldn't move. My body felt heavy, weighed down by a decade of silence and missed chances. The preacher mentioned Beckett's rodeo days, and I remembered watching him practice for hours in the dusty arena. The way his body moved in perfect sync with his horse, the determination in his eyes, the sweat glistening on his neck. I'd pretended I was there to keep him company, but really I just couldn't stay away. My vision blurred as tears finally broke free. Not here, not now. But the dam had broken. Every almost moment, every lingering look, every time I'd convinced myself tomorrow would be the day I'd tell him, it all crashed down around me. The truth gone with him. And I was left drowning in everything left unsaid. The preacher's words fade into a distant hum as my mind drifts back to that first day in sophomore year. I'd been struggling with my biology textbook in the school courtyard when a shadow fell across my pages. Looking up, I found myself staring at Beckett Hayes, his cowboy boots dusty from the ranch, and a gentle half-smile on his face. "You're in my biology class, right? Mind if I join you?" That moment changed everything. What started as study sessions turned into long talks under the oak tree behind the school. Beckett would show up with his lunch, always homemade, always enough to share. He'd tell me about life on the ranch, about breaking horses and mending fences, while I shared my dreams of college and finance. Weekends became our time. I still remember my first visit to his family's ranch. My hands trembled as I gripped the reins of the gentlest mare they owned. Beckett walked beside me, one hand on the horse's bridle, the other hovering near my leg, ready to steady me if needed. "Relax," he'd said, "she can sense your fear." His voice had this way of making everything feel manageable, possible. Those Friday nights at the rodeo became sacred. I'd sit in the stands, heart in my throat, watching Beckett compete. He moved like he was born on horseback, all fluid grace and quiet power. While other riders showed off for the crowd, Beckett just did what he did best. No flash, no showboating. Just pure skill, and that unwavering focus that made him who he was. After each competition, we'd drive out to Miller's Point in his beat-up Ford. The truck bed became our sanctuary, where we'd lay back, count stars, and talk about everything and nothing. Beckett would point out constellations his grandfather taught him, while I'd ramble about economics and the stock market. He never made me feel like my interests were boring or strange. He just listened, asked questions, actually cared. Time moved differently when we were together. Every moment felt both fleeting and eternal. I'd catch myself watching him when he wasn't looking, the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed, how his hands moved when he talked about something he loved. There were moments, quiet ones, when our eyes would meet, and the world would seem to pause. I'd feel words building in my throat, important words that needed to be said, but fear always pushed them back down. One night, after a particularly successful rodeo competition, we sat in our usual spot at Miller's Point. Beckett was still buzzing from his win, more animated than usual. The moonlight caught his profile just right, and my heart nearly burst with everything I couldn't say. He turned to me, that gentle half-smile on his face, and I almost told him then, almost found the courage to bridge that gap between friendship and something more. But I didn't. Instead, I congratulated him on his win and changed the subject to safer territory. The what-ifs of that moment would haunt me for years to come. The day Beckett told me about joining the Marines still haunts me. We sat on the rickety fence at his family's ranch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. His rodeo trophy from earlier that day gleamed in the back of his pickup truck. "I turned down Western Texas College," he said, his voice steady but quiet. My stomach dropped. The scholarship would have kept him close, kept him competing. "What? Why?" He shifted on the fence, his boots scraping against the wood. "After what happened in New York, I can't just sit here playing cowboy while others fight for our country." I gripped the fence tighter, splinters digging into my palms. The same hands that had patched him up after bad falls, that had helped him practice rope ties, that had wanted to reach for him so many times but never dared. "You don't have to do this. The scholarship, the rodeo circuit, that's your dream." Dreams change, Alex. The weeks before his departure blurred together. I helped him pack, listened to his parents' proud but worried conversations, watched him give away his rodeo gear to his younger cousin. Each day the weight in my chest grew heavier. On the morning he left for basic training, I drove him to the bus station. The sun hadn't even risen yet, and the parking lot was empty except for a few other recruits and their families. Beckett wore civilian clothes for the last time, his favorite worn jeans and that blue plaid shirt I always loved on him. "Write to me," he said, adjusting his duffel bag on his shoulder. Every week I promised, though the words felt inadequate. He pulled me into a tight hug, and I breathed in the familiar scent of his cologne mixed with leather and hay. My heart hammered against my ribs, screaming all the words I should say, but I stayed silent just like always. College became my escape. I buried myself in finance textbooks and campus activities, trying to fill the Beckett-shaped void with equations and social events. But every rodeo I passed made my chest ache. Every letter I got from him, filled with stories of training, of brotherhood, of purpose, reminded me of what I'd lost. Sometimes, late at night in my dorm room, I'd reread his letters until the words blurred together. His handwriting changed over time, becoming more rigid, more disciplined, just like him. Each envelope that arrived with that military postmark was both a blessing and a curse, proof he was alive, but also proof of how far he'd drifted from the cowboy I'd fallen in love with. The distance between us grew not just in miles, but in experiences. While I stressed about midterms and internships, he wrote about desert training and combat preparations. My world stayed safe and predictable. His became increasingly dangerous and unknown. With each passing month, I felt him slipping further away, becoming someone I might not recognize when he finally came home. The morning Beckett came back, I spotted his truck at Miller's gas station. My heart nearly stopped. 4 years had stretched between us like an endless desert. And now here he was, filling up his tank like any ordinary Tuesday. He looked different. Harder somehow, his shoulders broader, jaw more defined. The easy smile I remembered had been replaced by something more measured, careful. I pulled in, pretending I needed gas too. When he saw me, that reserved expression cracked into a grin I recognized from our past. We hugged, and I felt the new strength in his arms, smelled unfamiliar cologne mixed with the same old leather and hay scent that was purely Beckett. We fell back into our friendship, but something had shifted. Where we used to spend hours talking about nothing and everything, now conversations felt weighted with things unsaid. He'd mention places like Baghdad with a distant look in his eyes, then quickly changed the subject. I wanted to reach across that invisible barrier, tell him he could share anything with me, but the words stuck in my throat. I was seeing this guy Mark from the credit union. Nothing serious, just dinner dates and movies. But watching Beckett work his family's ranch, rebuilding fences and training horses with the same focus he'd had in our rodeo days, made my casual relationship feel hollow. Then Leela Monroe walked into town. I first saw them together at the Dairy Queen. She was all perfect blonde waves and practiced laughs, touching Beckett's arm while he told some story. My ice cream turned to acid in my stomach. Within weeks they were inseparable. Beckett looked at her like she hung the moon, while whispers about her in Richard Barnes, the married partner at a law firm, circulated through town like wildfire. I heard it from Sarah at the bank first, how Lila and Barnes would stay late at the office, how his BM was spotted outside her apartment. But Beckett, with his straight arrow Marine honor, never questioned her stories about working overtime or weekend conferences. He proposed 6 months after they met. The wedding invitation arrived in a cream envelope with gold lettering. I stuffed it in my desk drawer and got drunk that night, remembering all the moments I should have spoken up, That night after the rodeo, the morning at the bus station, any of the countless times since he'd returned. But I'd chosen silence, and now it was choking me. Seeing them around town became an exercise in self-torture. They'd stop by the bank sometimes, Lila hanging on his arm while making deposits from her law firm job. She'd flash that megawatt smile, call me sweetie, while I died a little inside, watching Beckett beam at her with pure devotion. The same look I'd dreamed of seeing directed at me. I started taking my lunch breaks at odd hours to avoid running into them at the diner. Made excuses to skip town events where I knew they'd be. But in a place this small, there was no escaping the reality the man I loved had married someone else, someone I wasn't sure deserved him. It had been a few months since the wedding. The kind of months that drag, heavy, like boots caked in mud when it rains. I kept myself busy with the usual grind at the bank. Transactions, loan applications, endless paperwork. It's funny how that kind of monotony doesn't really stop the noise in your head. Every time I'd see Beckett's name pop up in some local paperwork, cattle permits, property taxes, my stomach would drop in that ridiculous way it's been doing for the past decade. I wanted to give him space, I guess. Figured Lila was digging her claws in, keeping him busy or distracted. Whatever it is people like her do. God, how many times had I run into them on the sidewalks, her bright smile plastered on, hand clamped around his arm like some kind of leash. It's not that Beckett wasn't smiling too, but it never reached his eyes. Not in the way it used to, back in the days when we'd ride out on his family's ranch, talking about anything but what really needed to be said. Then out of nowhere last week he texted me. Just a blunt lunch. And the place, Blue Creek Cafe. It wasn't a request. I could hear his voice in the words, something off, some unspoken urgency. So I went. When I walked in, I spotted him immediately in the far booth, slouched into his leather jacket like the world weighed too damned much. He glanced at me as I slid in across from him. His face, he looked worn out, and not the way you look after a long day of ranch work. His eyes were red, glossy, telling me he hadn't slept. Perhaps not in a while. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. It wasn't like him to dance around things, and today there was no small talk about cattle prices or the latest fiasco at the rodeo. He got straight to the point, and man, the point cut sharper than most could handle. Lila just had the baby. I nodded slowly, not knowing where this was going yet, but sensing it wouldn't be good. He had about 3 seconds of silence before he laughed, something cold and bitter lodged deep in his throat. But it ain't mine. My head snapped up. The booth suddenly felt too close, too tight. I couldn't find words. Probably because he wasn't talking in a way that invited sympathy or shock. His tone, flat, lifeless, didn't leave space for anything. You heard me. Beckett's voice cracked, just barely. Black. The baby's black. Everything seemed to slow down. I blinked at him, making sure I'd heard him right, making sure I wasn't inventing this nightmare just because my brain couldn't fucking handle it. Lila. Infidelity. A whole baby. I don't think I breathed for a solid minute. Beckett frowned, shaking his head and staring down at the linoleum as if it held the answers. This whole time, he muttered, barely loud enough to hear. She knew. And she let me make a fool of myself. Another bitter laugh, this one harder, sharper, as if every piece of him was falling apart under its weight. I mean, hell, I was raising that kid in my head, you know? And now. He snapped his mouth shut like he couldn't take the words any further. I wasn't sure if he was going to throw a punch or throw his whole life away right there. I swallowed. What did Lila say? She laughed. His voice twisted like it was choking on itself. She had the audacity to smirk. Told me what? You think I'm not going to have a life while you're always out with cows and dirt? Beckett's hand clenched into a fist on the table, his knuckles turning white. I asked how long it'd been going on. She says months. Months, Alex. And she asked me if I was man enough to raise somebody else's kid. He looked up at me then, and the raw fury in his eyes hit me like a sucker punch, like it was nothing. I felt my own body tense, as if Beckett's pain was leaking into my skin. I could see him trying to keep it together, but the cracks were showing. And hell, what could I even say? Every line felt wrong, useless, like throwing drops of water on a wildfire. The divorce. You're? Yeah. Beckett leaned back in the booth, his voice lowering. Already started it. Got a lawyer up in Austin. But Alex, he paused, his voice growing real low, like he was afraid to even say it. I gotta make sure she doesn't touch my family's ranch. That's the only thing left. I can't let her take it from me. From my parents' memory. I heard the real weight beneath the words. The ranch, it was basically all Beckett had now, the one living part of his past that hadn't slipped away. He wouldn't survive losing it. Not after losing everything else. She won't. The words came out of my mouth before I even thought. It wasn't a question. It wasn't up for debate. I knew, no, I had to make sure of it. His eyes flickered toward mine, a mixture of hope and desperation, like he didn't quite believe me but needed to. He was waiting for a solution, waiting for something concrete. So no confrontation? I asked, sliding further into the booth now. With her, I mean. It'll just give her fuel. You stir shit up, and she'll find a way to use it. Beckett frowned but didn't argue, so I pressed on. If you want that ranch safe, the best thing right now is to keep your distance. Let the lawyers deal with her, okay? I'll help you find a way to secure it. I wasn't entirely sure how I was going to pull this off, but facts didn't need to be hashed out just yet. You trust me, right? I muttered, my voice softer this time, hoping he heard the truth in it. Beckett leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table as if the weight was too heavy to stand upright. Yeah, man, his voice rasped. You're the only one I trust right now. I nodded, barely letting my face betray the wave of relief those words brought. This was about Beckett, about fixing this piece by piece, no matter how messy it got in the middle. Hell, I couldn't lose him, not like this. Not again. That night, when Beckett called, his voice was a little more hoarse than usual. It was late, well past midnight, but I was already wide awake, staring at my ceiling, thinking about everything that had gone down, where his life had led him, where I'd let mine drift. I picked up the phone, not needing a single word to know what the call was about. We had already discussed the plan a few times by then, but this felt real. Like the weight of it would fall all at once on my shoulders. He told me he was ready to move forward, to disappear from this town, and from Lila's reach for good. I had it all figured out in my head. There was that repossessed property just outside the county line. Nothing fancy, but enough. A small, run-down house that sat on a decent plot of land with a barn big enough for a few horses. The agent at the bank didn't even blink when I arranged for Beckett to take it over. Just filed the paperwork like it was any other foreclosure cleanup. Nobody would think twice if Beckett moved there. Quietly, like he was just needing some space, something that looked temporary before Lila came after in full force. Not even Lila. I'd made sure of that. Once the house was sorted, the harder part came. That line of credit was something Beckett wasn't all too comfortable with at first. He'd been raised to take pride in what you own, not what you owe. But desperate times call for desperate moves. We both understood. Lila would eventually come sniffing after the ranch because of course she would. Hell, it's the only thing worth anything to her. And the only way to stop her in her tracks was to make it look like the ranch was no longer worth the trouble. Beckett withdrew $500,000 against it, a figure so steep even Lila's eyes would twitch. It was a necessary step, a calculated risk. We planned the charity ride as the stage for all of it. The sheriff's department took care of the logistics, but only Beckett and I knew what was about to go down. This wasn't something we could rehearse either. The river, it was perfect. Recent rains had swollen it past its usual lazy width, but it was never something that anyone worried about. People crossed it on horseback all the time. It was supposed to be routine. Beckett just had to make it look like things went south while he was leading the group. Simple. That morning, when we met by the barn, his eyes looked tired and worn in a way that no amount of sleep could ever fix. He wore a plain black wool coat, nothing to mark the moment, nothing that looked out of the ordinary, and as the sun cracked the horizon, we didn't even say much. We didn't have to at that point, just a nod, a reassurance. Nothing verbal needed. I didn't dare bring up Lila except to say, this'll stop her. For good. And it would. She'd never expect him to pull something this drastic. I knew her type. Always thinking a few steps ahead, but never expecting someone to outwit her at the level she thought she operated. The ride started like any other. The sheriff's group was chattering, a bunch of weekend cowboy volunteers cracking jokes and slapping saddles. Beckett was leading up front, guiding the other riders toward the river, his posture straight and steady, like none of this rattled him. But I watched. I could pick up on the subtleties, the slight delay in his movements, the tension in the hand that gripped the reins. Everything was tight, too deliberate. When we reached the riverbank, Beckett glanced back, giving me that understated look we'd perfected over 2 decades. The rain-swollen river ran loud and fast below us. He didn't hesitate long before kicking his horse forward into the current, just like we planned. The horse reared slightly as it hit the deeper water, then struggled against the force of the river. Halfway across, I saw Beckett yank the reins and lose balance intentionally. The horse bucked hard and Beckett fell, or at least it looked that way. He plunged into the rushing water, disappearing underneath in an instant. It worked perfectly. Panic rippled through the group. Everyone dropped their reins, screaming his name, rushing to the edge of the riverbank in a tangle of bodies and splashing water. They called out to him, calling the sheriff's department and scattering to try and help. But watching the river was like staring into a void. Beckett was nowhere to be seen, like he'd just been swallowed whole. The search went on for hours. Men on horseback patrolled both sides of the river. Anyone who was there combed the water surface and its banks. They sent divers in farther downstream and everybody pitched in, but inside I knew they wouldn't find anything. Beckett was gone, just like we planned. By the time the sun disappeared, the air around the group thickened with resignation. His horse had swum back to shore and wandered into the woods like nothing had happened. But people knew horses didn't cry over lost riders. They just moved on. When I rode back into town after dark and people lined the streets, asking me what the hell had happened, I kept it together. The only way this plan was ever going to hold was if I played my part convincingly too, and that meant looking like I'd just seen my lifelong friend vanish in front of me, which, in a way, I had. A couple of days after Beckett had died, I found myself planted right back at the bank, waiting. The funny thing about Lila was that I could have predicted her move down to the second. So, when she stormed in, dragging her latest lover, some slick lawyer from downtown, with her, I didn't need a clock to remind me how right I was. Their faces were ripe with fury the moment they stepped through the doors. There was a new layer of anger, though. A mess of emotions under her cool, calculated exterior that almost had me laughing. She was furious. And it wasn't just because Beckett was dead. It was because she wasn't getting what she thought was hers. What the hell happened to all the money? Her voice tore through the lobby like a thunderclap. I just leaned back in my chair, feigning the utmost calm, like I'd done 1,000 times before. I didn't have to say much, just pulled up the financial records and laid everything out in front of them, like pieces to a puzzle. The ranch is in debt, Lila. They stared at the numbers on the screen. The $500,000 Beckett had withdrawn, the sheer impossibility of it. The lawyer's face went pale as his mouth gaped open, running the numbers again in his head, trying to find a loophole that didn't exist. It was his property. He had every right to do what he wanted with it. I didn't need to see the panic on her face to understand how perfect this played out. The church emptied slowly after Beckett's funeral service. I stood near the exits, shaking hands and accepting condolences from people who knew us both since high school. Every "I'm so sorry for your loss" felt like a knife twisting in my gut, not from grief, but from the weight of knowing the truth. Mrs. Peterson, Beckett's old math teacher, grabbed my hand between both of hers. Such a tragedy. First that awful business with his wife, and now this. Her eyes welled up. You were always such good friends. I nodded, keeping my face carefully composed. Behind her I spotted Lila in a black dress that probably cost more than a month's mortgage payment, dabbing at dry eyes with a tissue. Her new boyfriend hovered nearby, trying to look appropriately somber. Sheriff Miller cornered me by the church steps. Damn shame about those ranch debts. Beckett never struck me as the type to be reckless with money. Times were tough after everything with Lila, I said, the practice response coming easily. The ranch wasn't doing well. The following days blurred together. I buried myself in work at the bank, fielding questions about Beckett's accounts and the mounting evidence of his financial troubles. Each time Lila's lawyer called demanding documentation, I provided exactly what we prepared. A perfect paper trail showing how Beckett had legitimately, if desperately, leveraged everything he owned. 3 weeks after the funeral, my secretary buzzed me. "Mr. Tate, Mrs. Hayes is here to see you." Lila burst into my office before I could respond, waving a piece of paper. What the hell is this? I glanced at the foreclosure notice, then back at her flushed face. "Standard procedure when payments are missed, Mrs. Hayes." This is ridiculous. That ranch has been in Beckett's family for generations. And now it's collateral against substantial debts. I kept my voice level, professional. Debts that remain unpaid. You know damn well Beckett wouldn't have wanted this. The irony of her invoking what Beckett would have wanted made something cold settle in my chest. What Beckett wanted was a faithful wife and a family. We don't always get what we want. She recoiled like I'd slapped her. For a moment her mask slipped and I saw real fear in her eyes. She'd played her games, thinking she held all the cards. Now she was realizing just how thoroughly she'd lost. "I'll fight this," she hissed. "You're welcome to try." I smiled politely. "But I suggest reviewing the loan documents first. Everything is quite clearly spelled out." I watched her storm out, heels clicking against the floor. The satisfaction I felt wasn't quite happiness. Nothing about this situation could make me truly happy. But it was something close to justice. That evening I sat alone in my living room, nursing a bourbon and thinking about Beckett. Somewhere out there he was free. Free from Lila's manipulation, free from the weight of generations of family expectations. I'd given him that gift, at the cost of carrying this secret alone. I pulled out my phone, thumb hovering over his number, still saved, though I knew it would never connect again. Some prices were worth paying. Lila was already full of bluster and indignation by the time we reached the bank vault. She wore that smug little smile, the one I'd seen countless times before. The kind you have when you think you've won the game before it's even begun. Standing there beside her, I could almost feel the heat rising in the room. The lawyer, Cole, a man whose face had become tight and drained of all humor over the weeks, fidgeted with the court papers as the manager approached. He made a point of not looking at me. I didn't say a word, didn't need to. The whole thing was unfolding exactly how Beckett and I had planned. We both knew Lila would come after everything she thought she was owed. We both knew she'd stop at nothing to get it, not after the humiliation of the divorce, not after the baby wasn't his. She had too much pride for that. So when Cole came in waving the court order, demanding to see what Beckett had left in his safe deposit box, I couldn't exactly stop them. Legally, anyway. But God, I knew what was waiting for us in that vault. The manager, nerves barely held together, slid the key into the lock and twisted. The steel groaned, and the lid slowly lifted. From where I stood, I could see Cole's face drop first. But it was Lila's reaction that really got me. She leaned forward, expecting to see stacks of cash, deeds, maybe whatever remnants of wealth Beckett hadn't already siphoned out and hidden. Instead, she found nothing. I didn't smile. Not outwardly. But deep down, I could feel this slow satisfaction, like flicking off a switch after years of being kept in the dark. There it was, proof she had nothing. No leverage. No power. Lila blinked, confusion morphing into fury faster than I'd ever seen. Her hand shot toward the box as if maybe, just maybe, she could will something into existence there. Some hidden compartment. Some final twist to save her from falling apart. But it was just empty space. The reality of it hit her like a kick to the stomach. "What the?" she hissed, spinning on the lawyer. She was shaking, chest rising fast with every breath. "You said." Cole's face flushed, and he avoided looking her in the eye, staring down at the papers he held like they'd give him some sort of answer. But deep down, we all knew the truth. Anything Beckett had left he'd either burned or taken with him far away, out of reach, just like we'd intended. For Lila, this was the end of the line. "He emptied it," Cole muttered. "He must have emptied it before." "You think?" Lila cut him off, voice sharp, venomous. She knew her luck had run out, but watching her trying to lash out, trying to grab onto whatever thread of control remained, it was pitiful. Pathetic, even. I didn't speak. Just stood there, feeling more like a spectator than anything else. Watching her unravel was almost methodical. The shock, the anger, the moment of total disbelief. She turned on Cole, lips tight with anger. Words like daggers flew at him. "What the hell do I pay you for?" Cole, already retreating in his own way, held up a hand. You knew what this was going into it. You knew there were risks. But those cold legal terms, the safe phrases he kept dropping, wouldn't sink into her now. Lila only saw the empty box, the non-existent fortune, the life she thought she'd claim for herself slipping through her fingers. It was Beckett's ghost, casting a shadow down on her even in his absence. Lila's tirade spiraled into a frantic mess, spewing threats and insults, but the odd thing was, it wasn't directed at me. All the bitterness, all the judgment, it was saved for him. Cole didn't fight back either. He held those papers like they were a shield, but with each word, each wave of her wrath, something in him cracked. You could see it in his eyes. Like he knew this was turning into a storm he couldn't walk out of. Maybe he thought he'd get through this with enough paperwork and smooth talk. But watching Lila turn on him with such intensity, I think he started to understand how deep he'd gotten. She wasn't letting up. You're a failure. I could do more without your useless ass dragging me down. She towered over him, red-faced, practically frothing with anger. And he, this once proud figure, this supposedly powerful man, he fell apart in silence. By the time her words choked on her own rage, Cole just nodded. He didn't fight anymore, just nodded and walked out, leaving her standing there. Alone, you could almost hear something snap between them. Whatever bond they'd formed through their greed, their shared schemes, dissolved in that moment. He knew he wasn't coming back from this. I watched him slip out before Lila could throw another barb. She stood there. It was a long silence, too long. She didn't even look at me. She just stood in front of the empty deposit box, fists clenched by her side. I could see it now, all that life she'd imagined, the grand plan she had for her future, crumbling around her. She had played a hand she wasn't even part of and lost everything. Out of sheer courtesy, or maybe just habit, I cleared my throat. I believe we're done here, Lila. Her head snapped around, eyes blazing for a second, as if she had one last bit of fire in her. But when she saw my calm expression, saw the unbothered serenity I'd worn this whole time, whatever she still had left died in her throat. She pushed past me without a word, out of the vault, heels striking the floor a little harder than seemed necessary. She didn't look back. Later, I heard bits and pieces about Cole's downfall. Word spreads fast in a small town. His wife left him not long after, took the kids with her too. The law firm didn't want anything more to do with him once all the dirt started floating around. Connections to Lila, the dodgy deals, the underhanded way he tried to manipulate Beckett's estate. They pulled his license within weeks. As for Lila, the rumors followed her like a bad smell. She tried clawing her way into whatever job she could find, anything that would offer her a lifeline. She wasn't picky anymore. Word had it she was cleaning houses now, which felt ironic given how much she tried to climb up the social ladder. There was something cold and satisfying about seeing her fall to rock bottom, watch her struggle in ways she'd never imagined. She'd gambled with Beckett's name, with his trust, hell, even with his life, and lost it all. That ranch, his money, whatever future she thought she had, it was gone. Just like Beckett. I've kept Beckett's secret for almost 30 years now. Time has a way of softening the edges of memories, but some remain razor sharp. The weight of knowing he's alive sits differently these days, less like a burden and more like a treasured possession I get to protect. I met David at a finance conference in Houston. He saw past my careful walls, past the small-town banker facade. We dated long distance at first, which suited me fine. I needed time to reconcile my lingering feelings for Beckett with this new chapter. David never pushed, just offered steady warmth and understanding. When he proposed 3 years later, I said yes without hesitation. Our wedding was small, just close family and friends in David's backyard in Austin. No church would have us back home, but we didn't mind. The garden was strung with lights, and David's smile outshone them all. Still, I caught the whispers when we moved back to my hometown. The sidelong glances at the grocery store, the way some folks suddenly found other banks to do business with. Sometimes I think about Beckett down in Argentina. The last photo he managed to get to me showed his new ranch, sprawling and green against mountains I'll never see in person. He looked happy, at peace in a way he never was here. I keep that photo locked away in my home office, next to the dried flowers from my wedding boutonniere. David knows there are parts of my past I can't share, and he accepts that. On quiet evenings when we sit on our back porch, his hand in mine, I'm struck by how fortunate I am to have found this kind of love. It's different from what I felt for Beckett, steadier, more certain. But that first love still lives in me, like a book one know by heart, but can never read aloud. The town's gotten better about David and me over the years, though some still purse their lips when we hold hands at the diner. Mrs. Peterson, who once gossiped about Beckett's awful business, now brings cookies at Christmas for her favorite boys. Progress comes slow in small towns, but it comes. I've built a good life here, a loving marriage, a respected position at the bank, a home filled with warmth. Yet there are moments, usually late at night, when I remember those summer evenings with Beckett under Texas stars. All those words caught in my throat. I've learned to live with those memories, to let them be what they are, beautiful, bittersweet, and forever unfinished. Hey everyone, if you enjoyed the story, remember to like, subscribe, and comment on the video for more stories like this. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss an update. If you have any similar stories to share, leave them in the comments and we'll make sure to bring them to life. Thanks for watching.